Good morning, BookTube, and welcome to new subscribers. It's been a little quiet here, at least on the YouTube front. Not in my life. My life has been filled with a lot of background noise. I live by a highway, and July was wild. July had quite a few events on the highway, in the apartment building, just not conducive to a calm working environment. I always hope that you're not hearing as much as I am, so fingers crossed. Welcome back. We are looking at an anthology today that I am absolutely delighted to share with you. I've been champing at the bit to share this one with you. As you might be able to see on the screen, it is Life Beyond Us. It's put out by the European Astrobiology Institute. The editor is Julie Nováková. And that's all I'm going to tell you about the names in this piece, because as I move us through this collection, I do not want to fixate on celebrity culture. There are some names here very prominent in our industry, and there are others you might not know. And I just want you to enjoy reading the whole of this because it is a cohesive unit, a wonderful meditation on the many different ways that life can manifest, might manifest in the cosmos, and the many ways that we as human beings might have to change and adapt ourselves and reframe our thinking, our modes of investigation in order to fully embrace the wonders that exist in the universe. This is probably the best science fiction anthology that I have read in quite some time. It will absolutely appeal to hard sci-fi fans especially. It is cohesive in terms of the overall unit, and each individual story is also something that invites you truly to sit with the ideas that it raises. Each story is paired with a science fact article. So on top of the tremendous rigor you will find in individual stories, each one will be accompanied by an essay that sometimes reflects on the overall plausibility of the ideas therein, or just explains some of the concepts a little further, because there is a tremendous amount of technical detail that is deftly presented within a science fictional context and then expounded upon in the fact. Just something that will enliven, I think, the minds of writers as well as readers, something that will stimulate you if you have been a little bit disenchanted by the state of science fiction as of late, just because science fiction tends to move towards softer realms. Even my own writing, absolutely. I am guilty of this too. I focus on social contract theory a lot in my stories. And although I do research, there are some givens or some conventions in the genre that sometimes I will just accept for the purposes of telling the story I want to tell. This is different. This collection has a level of rigor to it that we all aspire toward in all our work. So I do find this to be one of the best pieces that I've seen in a while, and I sorely hope that folks will pick it up and absorb it, enjoy it, both as a whole and with respect to individual components. To that end, rather than celebrate specific authors therein, I'd love just to read a couple segments of this piece. One is from a science fact component, and one is from a story. I will not tell you the authors for either of these, but what I will do is highlight how much this work is then reflected in other pieces. So hopefully I will pique your interest. So I sorely hope that in the background there isn't actually an ambulance. I can hear an ambulance, but I apologize. Take it as ambient background noise because I have truly tried to record this a few times and there have just been so many interruptions. Okay, so with patience and calm and maybe a little bit of ambient background noise, let us talk about the universe. Let me tell you a little secret in the astrobiology community. We have no universally agreed upon definition for what life as a physical phenomenon actually is. If you talk to enough experts on the subject, you'll start to pick up themes. That life maintains itself through homeostasis, that it reproduces sometimes, that it responds to its environment, and that it can undergo Darwinian evolution. But for every one of these traits, there's a counterexample. After all, living things use energy from their environment to sustain themselves and can reproduce, but the same is true for a flame. Organisms adapt to changing conditions in their environment, but so does the cruise control in your car. Life reproduces itself and is subject to the forces of the evolution in the process, except for sterile animals like mules and including things like viruses that are of dubious liveliness. It may perhaps be best to think of life not as a strict binary, but a spectrum. A tree is more alive than a virus is more alive than a rock. However, this doesn't remove the challenge of being able to easily differentiate between living and non-living systems out in the real world. This dilemma of what life is exactly becomes particularly relevant when grappling with the possibility of life as we don't know it. If a living system inhabits an environment radically different from our own, or is based on biochemistry disparate from what we're familiar with, would we even recognize it as such? Now, this is one meditation in science fact about how we struggle with trying to find other species and see them as life. Many of these stories do explore a wide range of different possibilities based on different biochemical natures, based on, in some cases, different notions of a collective consciousness in particular. But inside that definition, that description here, I think you can also hear one other element that we really want from good quality science fiction on this subject, not just a list of other elements and other possibilities, but an exploration of the human limits to perception. What is in us that limits us from being able to reframe how we view our place in the cosmos and recognize and embrace the fact that there is variation there. Quite a few of these stories do have first contact scenarios, obviously, but many of those first contact scenarios are mitigated initially or at some point in the process by our limits of understanding. This creates a tremendous reflection on the fact that as much as we are itchy to know if we are in fact alone in the cosmos, we often are closed off even to ourselves and even to possibilities that exist among ourselves. So how on earth can we be ready for the splendor of the universe? This piece works so well, I know now I'm talking about the anthology as a whole, because it is inviting us not just to think about different possibilities and different ways of seeing that are necessary, but also very much the work that we as a species need to do to be ready for those wonderful encounters. And I think this matters especially because I'm pretty sure most of us are not going to be surprised when we do eventually find signs of microbial life inside our solar system. I think on one level, most of us are pretty darn ready to just embrace, yep, there are microbes or worm microbes in an active form on Mars, or perhaps under the ice in one of the moons in our system, or perhaps on Titan with its tremendously different methane system, which is discussed in one of the stories here. But beyond all of that, there's the question of, okay, so if microbes aren't thrilling you, why aren't microbes thrilling you? Well, again, we are ready for these big, exciting encounters with something that resembles ourselves. And there is going to have to be a leap for us as a species into truly embracing the splendor of a wide range of forms of life. And yet, when we lean into that splendor, it's going to mean a lot of reframing our response to life in all its strange and wondrous forms here on Earth. And that's another element of this text that's a bit understated. It's just under the surface, but it's certainly present. all of this work in terms of learning how to look at the cosmos differently with greater curiosity absolutely has an impact on how we think about ourselves within the ecosystems we have. Do we recognize all the strange and wondrous forms of life that already exist? And how do we interact with them? How do we curate them? How do we steward? There's even one piece here that reflects on our conservation efforts, such as they are, and it works within the overall theme because it imagines us using other worlds for a very complicated relationship to conservation of species from Earth. And yet when you read that piece, what makes it so painful is that it's not something fabulous or fantastical or belonging to the future. It is a science fiction story that is reflecting very much on some very difficult choices and unethical behaviors that exist around us all the time. So as much as that definition suggests that we are struggling with this definition of life, it also has an undercurrent of reminding us that we don't really understand life here on Earth. So how on earth can we be ready for life beyond? That's just a wonderful meditation that the whole collection picks up. Okay. One other section is going to be from a story. Probably, I don't know. I'm not going to hint about the author, but the author is very well known for work that should estrange us from our sense of self. And this piece is definitely no exception to that rule. Over the years, I have come to regard language itself as a kind of violence, a straitjacket at best, a square hole into which humanity would force any shape indifferent to the meaning and nuance that might be scraped away in the process. Apes flapping their fingers in parodies of ASL, parrots twisting their tongues around human speech, dolphins presented with touchscreens or glorified Morse. We like to pat ourselves on the back whenever our captives manage to squeeze themselves into these boxes, as if debasement somehow scales to intelligence. Can it map meanings onto symbols? Can it build recursive hierarchies, rearrange them in new and context-appropriate ways? Can it talk? I submit this is the wrong question. Perhaps a better one would be, why should it want to? Why would dolphins, for example, use words to describe emotional states when they can feel the echoes of their podmates' inmost selves, map out their fellows' heartbeats and heartaches in three-dimensional ultrasound? What use is there for nouns and adjectives among solitary cephalopods who paint pictures on their skin, change shape and texture, turn their whole bodies into dioramas? Does anyone truly believe there is some specific arrangement of phonemes that could truly convey your experience of watching a sunrise? The best any such code can hope for is to kickstart someone else's memories and hope for enough overlap to convey a reasonable approximation. Language is not always wisdom. Sometimes it's just a workaround for lack of better alternatives. So, this story, of course, deals with communication. Many of the stories in this collection deal with trying to communicate and trying to understand how information is imparted in different species, arrangements of life forms most unusual. And there's a lot of room and play and delight in that theme for science fiction writers, definitely engaged in similar in some of my own work. But this piece in particular, what I just read, struck me so much in relation to maybe a philosopher you know, maybe you don't. Lacan is somewhat famous within certain academic circles, late 20th century theorist who had a lot to say about linguistics with a huge focus on social philosophies, let's put it that way. I don't want to get into too much of the philosophy, but I want to talk about one element. He's also known a lot of behavioral studies and development, but I'm not quite the point that I want to make with him. So there's one element in his philosophy which deals with the idea that language, far from being this sign of elevated existence and sentience, is itself a kind of concession. And that the moment we start to use language to communicate with one another is the moment when we have essentially conceded to, acknowledged and conceded to the fact that there is a distance between me and anyone else. And that gap is a painful bridge that we will spend our lives trying to surmount. The very use of language is always, in some ways, a reminder of our distance from one another. It is the ultimate estrangement. And yet this is not something we like to think about often. Language is how we connect. Language is the bridge. And yes, language is the bridge, but language is also, by being the bridge, an acknowledgement of the fact that a gap exists in the first place, and that gap can be lonely, especially because most of our bridges are insufficient. So again, this collection, in dealing with communication strategies, in dealing with the what-ifs around other species, other possible life forms, also necessarily highlights the gaps that already exist between us and even within us, because as much as the idea of language can estrange one from other people, the idea that if I need to say something in order to be understood by another entity, that must mean that there is distance between us, there's otherness, the entity does not intrinsically share all of my thoughts. And yet we also use language to understand ourselves. So when one moves through life beyond us with this wide array of stories, some of which deal with first contact, some of which deal with some of the kinds of methods we will need to use in order to broaden our search parameters, and some of which deal with the ethics around all of this. In fact, the first piece is a direct statement of an ethical quagmire. Instead of leaping right into our little green men, we start with this question of what are we willing to compromise in order to answer questions like this for ourselves. Wonderful work. And amid all of it is this underlying question about whether we are truly ready to know ourselves and to meet ourselves. If everything else in the cosmos is truly, quite possibly, strange in ways that we can't even fully imagine, what does that also say about what we take for granted about the strangeness that exists even here on Earth or within ourselves? How confident are we truly that we know one another and ourselves? This is a collection then that has obviously a phenomenal focal point. It is concentrated around a specific body of topics, but like the best science fiction, it should open you up to feeling estranged from other species on this planet and from yourself and from the ways that humans communicate amongst one another. Do we truly have the technology, the means, and the curiosity to make first contact with others here on Earth? When we look at the news, when we see our struggle to unite around common themes of great urgency around war, around climate change, I think we have to err on the side of the answer is no. We are not fully prepared for all the first contacts that are required here on Earth with other humans, with other sentient life forms, with life itself here on one pale blue dot. How then can we be prepared for the wonder that awaits, that exists, that transpires, irrespective of our attention in the rest of the cosmos? And how do we make ourselves ready? So this collection I highly recommend to science fiction writers. First and foremost, wrap yourselves on the knuckles, feel terrible about your own writing in relation to the rigor of this work, and enjoy, be stimulated, be inspired. And also to other readers in general, whether you are necessarily a science fiction fan or not, there is a tremendous amount of thought that it goes into this collection. It's very much a philosophical exercise as well. And you know how I feel about philosophy and fiction. So please do consider this piece. I truly think it is one of the best anthologies that we have seen in a long time in our genre, and I do hope that the rigor and curiosity and care that is represented in this collection will be seen in other ones too going forward. For now, thank you very much for paying attention. I know this is not a normal review in which one talks about specific stories, but I really want to get you excited about the themes and the work that this piece is doing as a whole. So Julie Nováková and the European Astrobiology Institute, thank you very much for your curatorial labor here. This collection truly should be read and revisited for quite some time ahead. Thank you all. Thank you again for all new subscribers. There should be, there's going to be some interesting content going forward, quite a range. But I hope that wherever you are doing well and managing the chaos in your own backgrounds as best as possible. Cheers all.